The Matrix is still one of the most visually distinctive movies out there, memorable as much for its stylish camera work as its iconic phosphorescent green color palette. And for me, this specific coloration is as much of a part of the movie's DNA as bullet time and trench coats, and something probably a lot of people who grew up with the film still strongly associate with it. But what if I were to tell you that not only is this not what the movie was supposed to look like, but that it didn't even look like this until almost 10 years after its original release? In May of this year, a new 4K remaster of the movie was released. Based on a completely new scan of the original camera negative, the remaster was overseen by the cinematographer of the original film with the intention of creating both a higher resolution version of the film and one that more accurately captured what the film originally looked like in theaters. And this look, it turns out, is remarkably different from what I've been showing so far, the same version that I'd grown up on and assumed was the quote-unquote correct version. So let's take a look. This clip and all the previous ones are off the 2008 remastered Blu-ray, which has been the standard HD version of the film for the past 10 years. And this is the 4K rescan. Parts of the movie that are supposed to be green still are, but skin tones are warmer and more natural, the reds and blues of the graffiti and lighting in the background are clearer and much more vibrant, and blacks and overall contrast are clear and dense, with small details like the green-tinged costuming a lot more obvious with the broad green filter removed. The difference between them is pretty striking, especially seeing the two next to each other, and that raises a question: how did these two versions of the exact same film, using the exact same source material, end up looking so different? And this isn't the only example of a film going through radical visual changes from theatrical source material to home release. In fact, it's actually a lot more common than you'd think. So today, we're going to dig through the process responsible for all this, and see if we can figure out how this happens.
All I'm offering is the truth. Nothing more.
To explain this phenomena, first we have to understand what a movie goes through from filming to home release. During pre-production, a director and the cinematographer decide roughly how a film is going to look. Is this going to be a warm film? Is this going to be a dark film? Realistic? Exaggerated? And so on. Then, on set, they work with lighting and camera teams, as well as set, costuming, and other production designers to get the decided look just right in camera. Once filming is done, digital footage is downloaded, and analog film is scanned at a place called the telecine bay, making it ready for post-production. At this point, you may have the raw substance of the film, but the look isn't quite there. Due to unpredictable issues during production, oftentimes many shots or scenes don't quite match each other or aren't exactly the way the filmmakers want them.
Every single shot, especially within a scene, they gotta live. You cut from this shot to this shot and they're not matched, bang, you're out of the film.
So from here, you take your footage to the lab to be color corrected, fixing any of the problems it might have, and then the fixed footage is color timed or graded. This is where the footage, which usually comes in somewhat flat or dull, goes through a process to punch it up and get closer to how they want the final film to look. This is part of what gives a movie like Fight Club its grungy, gritty look, or Moonrise Kingdom its warm pastel tones, or for a more extreme case, that heavy teal wash that popped up in a lot of 2000s American horror movies. The Matrix isn't even 20 years old now, but a whole lot has changed since it came out. In its time, and going back, once the process of color correction and timing the film was complete, as well as a number of other post-production processes, the final film was printed onto rolls of celluloid film of varying types, some meant for archiving, and others from which projection copies would be made.
Then, when it goes to DVD, you gotta go into the telecine bay again, because what you did in film doesn't translate to what you do in high def. Color correct every single shot, every single scene.
And this is where things can go disastrously wrong. Obvious technical problems can arise, such as massively decayed negatives or parts of the reel missing. And even when it's together and in good condition, sometimes analog film isn't perfectly flexible in the transition.
In the case of Wild at Heart, we noticed that it was a little funky in places, but we were able to fix it until we got to night scenes. And night scenes, they just turn to pure garbage.
Mostly, however, it's the process of manually retouching each shot that lies in the heart of most errors in digital remasters of films. To get the highest quality transfer, colorists often try to use the original negative wherever possible, free of any previous image adjustments in the print copies. This provides them with a lot more room to play around with the image without degrading it, but it also leaves them a lot more work to get the film back to its original visuals, the exact point of which is often unknown to the new colorist. This usually isn't a problem when they're able to work closely with the cinematographer or director of the film, but in the many cases where no such person is available, a huge level of subjectivity is introduced to the equation. An experienced colorist can often make a good guess about what the intended final look of the film was based on reference prints in the base negative, but incorrect references can sometimes be misleading, preferences can differ, and techniques misused. With all this in mind, let's finally get back to our original question. What happened to make this version of The Matrix look so different than the original theatrical look? The first transfers of The Matrix used for the film's original DVD, VHS, and Laserdisc release looked a whole lot different than the other versions we've been looking at so far. As you can see, the green tint of the later versions is gone, but a whole lot is different from how the film looked in its theatrical version. All of the footage from the early DVD copies I was able to find seemed to have gone through a similar process. During the color correction phase, all of the green tinge from the filtration and lighting that we see in the theatrical timing seemed to have been corrected to neutral in most scenes. We still see remnants of the green in blatant cases like the computer screens, but most of what should be there has been corrected out, and with the green largely removed, huge chunks of the film take on a warm, monochromatic yellow tint instead. It's hard to say exactly how this happened without talking directly to the people who worked on it, but we can make a couple of educated guesses based on what we learned about the color timing process earlier. As we saw, color correction to natural tones is a very normal step for most transfers, as unnatural coloration, especially green, is usually read as a mistake. So it's not unthinkable that an unwitting colorist might take the film's largely green tinted negative and do something similar. I couldn't find any information about the cinematographer working on any transfer aside from the recent 4K one, so it's safe to assume that the colorists were acting alone. All it would take is some slightly off reference prints or them overlooking certain notes in the film's intended look to lead them off in this direction. Putting the two right next to each other, you can really see how a reasonably small miscalculation could have a huge impact on the final product. So what made the later versions go for such a different look?
Upgrades.
In 2003, the Wachowskis released both sequels to The Matrix Reloaded and The Matrix Revolutions, and while both films for the most part lean naturally into their green tone similar to the first film, they feature several standout scenes with a very heavy green grade. So if I were to guess, when it came time to remaster the film onto Blu-ray in 2008, the extreme grades in these scenes are what the colors looked to as the source material for what the original film was supposed to look like.
Where is this going?
When it comes to The Matrix, we're lucky to have such a clear timeline on how the movie's been mastered and transferred over the years, and such a solid guarantee from both the film's cinematographer, as well as from people who saw the film in its original run, that this new version is definitively the way that the film is supposed to be seen. But there's a lot of other films that aren't so lucky. While researching this video and seeing how many films end up with improper or subpar transfers and remasters, one of the questions I began to ask myself was how many films, for one reason or another, I'd never seen in the way that they were intended to be seen. Sometimes old negatives are lost, and all we're left with is subpar versions, as in the case with Citizen Kane. And sometimes directors drastically change the highest quality versions available, as when William Friedkin drastically recolored The French Connection when it initially came to Blu-ray. The Star Wars original trilogy has been notoriously rendered all but impossible to find in their original non-special edition versions, and it's to the point that desperate fans continue to work piecing together the films from scans of old theater prints in an effort to view the movies in their unaltered forms. And that's not even getting into all the films with a bunch of similar versions due to director recuts. Whenever I go back to watch Blade Runner, I have to consult a Wikipedia article to figure out which of the 5 differently edited versions I should be watching, and I'm still trying to figure out which of the 12 different versions of David Fincher's Seven is the most correct. As far as I can tell, it's either the Dutch Blu-ray or the one that's on iTunes. There's a whole article about it and a chart, and, well, you can see what I mean. And to be fair, there's a lot of people out there who are perfectly happy with the old versions of The Matrix, and some who think that this new remaster is the one that looks wrong. There's a lot tied up in the original way you saw something, and it's okay to enjoy that, but we can't forget that these movies are pieces of art, and they're worth taking care of and preserving. It's great where The Matrix ended up after all this time, but if the only correctly colored version of 7 is still exclusively on iTunes, I think we still might be doing something wrong.